They built national parks on the ruins of 86 or 87 destroyed Palestinian villages in 1948. Settler colonialism is ecological domination. Israel, since its inception, has been doing everything to plunder the water of Palestinians and Arab people in the region. 77 million people are emitting, hear this, are emitting more than 2/3 of the poorest in the planet.
One aspect of the Palestine liberation struggle which we rarely talk about is the climate justice aspect. To shed some light on this, I'm joined today by Hamza Hamouchene, who is a London-based Algerian researcher and activist, and he is a commentator and founding member of the Algeria Solidarity Campaign and Environmental Justice North Africa. Please enjoy. Hamza, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me and hosting me, Faris.
Well, the reason you're here is because I saw a video of yours very recently. It was shared by TNI, the Transnational Institute. And it was a very interesting take, which I've kind of been thinking along those lines for a while now, but I haven't been able to articulate it in any way. And I saw that video and I was like, I need to get Hamza on. I need to get him on. So I rummaged online to find your contact details, and finally you're here.
Thank you for getting in touch. Pleasure.
And you said something which was quite profound, which is that Palestinian liberation is inextricably linked to climate justice. But before we get into that, this is a very vast topic. I want us to lay the groundwork for us to kind of understand how we get there. Maybe we should start quite simple, actually, with what is climate change, how did we get here, and where might we be heading?
The video that you mentioned actually is a recording of a talk that I gave at one of the meetings organized by one of our partners called the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy. And it's part of the campaigning and advocacy work that I'm part of in terms of the global embargo, the energy embargo against Israel. And we are trying to mobilize, various actors from civil society to trade unions to escalate the pressure on Israel so we can stop the genocide very soon. But to come back to your question, I think those connections are not just, superficial. I believe that there will be no global climate justice without the liberation of Palestine. And as I said in that video, this is not merely a human rights or moral issue. It is essentially and fundamentally, a question of political economy, how Palestine and the Middle East is integrated into the global capitalist economy. And we will get there. But in terms of climate change, what we call man-made anthropogenic climate change is caused by the capitalist system, the way we produce and consume things. Clearly, the capitalist mode of production is not respectful of the environment, sees nature as a commodity to be dominated. You can make money out of it and also make it as a kind of a sink. And this is the fundamental contradiction in the capitalist system, which generates that climate crisis. So the capitalist system is that system where you externalize the socio-economic and environmental costs toward somewhere or something or somebody else. So you externalize those costs to women and carers in terms of the unpaid social reproduction work. You externalize it from urban to rural areas. You externalize it from the north, the richest parts of this world, the centers of empire, to the global south, to the peripheries of the system. And you externalize it to nature. That's why we have that climate crisis that we are seeing right now. That climate crisis, you cannot resolve it within the capitalist system. The ruling classes, for 30 years, they've been talking about addressing climate change, reducing CO2 emissions. 3 decades of blah, 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 as the young Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg has described it. And I completely agree with her. They have not resolved it. They are trying to make money out of it. And the climate crisis keeps escalating. So year after year in those climate summits, what is called the Conference of the Parties, the COP process, I think it's much more accurate to describe it as the Conference of Polluters, because they meet, they just talk, and continue expanding, fossil fuel operations, continue increasing the CO2 emissions without resolving it. And it has become clear that there will be no climate justice without addressing those fundamental contradictions in the capitalist imperialist system. So you need to have a kind of a class analysis. There is somebody, a Brazilian, trade unionist and environmentalist, who said, climate activism or environmentalism without, class analysis, without class struggle is just gardening. And also it has become clear that if you don't talk about questions of race, gender, colonial history, you're not going to really tackle the climate crisis from its root causes.
On the question of capitalism, for a layman like myself, I hear you talk about the capitalist, how capitalism has led to the crisis that we're in today. But one may ask, when we look at the Soviet Union, for example, they were self-proclaimed socialists or whatever they aspired to be. And they took part in, for example, the space race. I'm not sure what it's called exactly, but they were trying to build rockets and race to the moon with the US, and this would have caused some sort of effect on the environment. Is then also the Soviet Union's model associated with the climate crisis that we see today?
I think it depends how you qualify and how you analyze what kind of system took place in the Soviet Union. Some people call it socialism or communism. I think it was state capitalism. It was a planned economy. It was an industrializing economy, trying, to catch up with the West. I think what has become clear to everyone right now, especially with the escalating and the intensifying ecological and climate crisis, that we need to work within the boundaries, the natural boundaries that we have. We cannot break them. We cannot, we are seeing a huge loss of biodiversity. We are seeing, worsening and deadly climate impacts. So we need to rethink our relationship, first of all, to the environment and to nature, not see it just as a commodity to be, dominated or sold and bought, but also relationships between ourselves as humans. So exploitation of nature is also exploitation of humans. Exploitation of humans is also exploitation of nature. So we need to revise those things. So that's how I'm going to answer your question.
Is it possible in our current stage of human so-called development, we're over 8 billion humans strong, is it possible for us to create a sustainable way of living and to keep feeding the masses, essentially?
I strongly believe that we can, because what is the problem? That the easiest explanation, especially the liberal and let's say racist explanation, is the Malthusian one, to blame everything on the population numbers or the explosion of population growth and so forth, especially in the global south, right? That is the problem. But the reality is, the main problem is who owns the resources, who owns the wealth, and how it is distributed. There is so much wealth on the planet, but the capitalists amongst us, that ruling classes that dominates the economic and political system, they own the majority of the wealth and they distribute it towards them. So you see a lot of poverty, you see a lot of devastations in countries in the global south and in the global north. We are seeing poverty even in the UK right now because of those huge inequalities and how wealth is distributed. So I believe in a better system The system, for me, it's an eco-socialist system where wealth is distributed evenly amongst us, where the real producers, the workers or the working people, control their economic, food and energy systems and decide and have a democratic say in how those resources are used and for what purpose. I believe we can live in harmony with nature and there will be no poverty and no hunger.
So before we get to that, the solutions and the connection to Palestinian liberation, we probably should rewind a bit to the connection between colonialism and climate change, and maybe specifically on Palestine.
I think those connections are not clear to everybody. They are not clear to even some climate justice activists, because the climate justice movement is not a one whole. Like, there are differences, there are tendencies, there are different political orientations inside, but there are many segments, especially the most radical and progressive segments of the climate justice movement, who started seriously analyzing and bringing discussions of colonialism and imperialism to the climate justice discussions. In the case of Palestine, I think we need to go a little bit to the Nakba, to 1947, 1948, when Israel was founded by ruining and dispossessing and ethnically cleansing the Palestinians. Because one missing element of that conversation or that discussion is the environmental element, the environmental dimension of the Nakba. Because environment is usually seen as that secondary element, like you just add it to the conversation, or this, passive landscape, or just as a terrain of struggle. But in reality, when you go to colonialism, especially settler colonialism, as the type that we see in Palestine today, and the type that we've seen in other settler colonies like Algeria, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and others, even indigenous communities in the Americas, settler colonialism is ecological domination because it disrupts the relationships that humans have with their environments. And in that sort, it creates that ecological violence where there is an erasure of the ecology, the environments, the cultures of the indigenous, and their replacement by new colonial environment and ecologies and cultures. So in that respect, settler colonialism is pretty much a project of environmental domination and environmental violence. And actually, one of the researchers in forensic architecture, A.L. Weitzman, he used specific words that I really think are eloquent and summarizes our discussion. He says, colonialism, or the environment, he said, the environment is a means through which, colonial racism is enacted, land is grabbed, siege is expanded and enforced, and violence is perpetuated. So the environment is really an important dimension of that colonial enterprise. And we can go back, even to the colonial period in the 19th century when Algeria was invaded. And we see how colonialism came up with all those Orientalist environmental narratives. They are deeply racist and deceptive narratives, depicting, let's say, the environment in the Arab region as alien, defective, abnormal, degraded, needing some kind of intervention by the white man or the civilized world to repair, to improve, to restore, and to normalize. And that narrative plays a role. Its role is, first of all, it justifies dispossession. It justifies the colonial expansionist project. It justifies control and dominations of the local populations. That's why we say it's a colonial, environmental, orientalist narrative used by the colonial powers, Britain and France in the 19th century, and then Israel in the 20th century. Because Israel used exactly the same narrative of saying Palestine pre-1948 was a parched, empty desert. And when Israel was founded, suddenly Israel made the desert bloom, right? That's the narrative that they are putting forward there. But they don't tell you about the dispossession, the ethnic cleansing, the destruction of villages, the expulsion of people, the massacres, the killing. So it plays that role of hiding all these crimes and then positing those colonial powers, including Israel, as environmental stewards, green champions. They are doing afforestation projects. They are creating conservation forests. They are doing all these national parks. And when you look at the details, like the Jewish National Fund, it's one of the parastatal Israeli organizations that played a role in the Orientalist environmental narrative. They built national parks on the ruins of 86 or 87 destroyed Palestinian villages in 1948. And the story does not end there, because the Palestinians or the colonized people gets depicted as those ecological savages, you know. They do not know how to preserve their environments. And in fact, they destroy their environments. So we need to be there to show them how to preserve their environment. And, you know, that justifies many dispossessing practices in terms of land grabs, in terms of not letting people come back to their own lands, in terms of, you know, crushing the resistance of the local populations. But it's not just about land. It's also about water. You know, if we look at, just because we're talking about specifically Israel and Palestine in this discussion, Israel, since its inception, has been doing everything to plunder the water of Palestinians and Arab people in the region. When I say plunder, it's plunder. Like steal water from the rivers, not allow Palestinians and other Arab people, you know, to access those waters. In some instances, like the Jordan River, the part of Palestinians from the Jordan River they don't get it. The Yarmouk River is the same. You see how the structures of water apartheid, what you call water apartheid, how Israelis live a life of really excessive water consumptions, much more than we have here in the West, while the Palestinians suffer from acute water crisis, exacerbated by that climate change that we are talking about. So what we are seeing, just to summarize, what we are seeing, rather than the narrative that Israel made the desert bloom, what we saw in the last 4 to 5 decades, including in the current ongoing genocide, a slow process of desertification of Palestinian lands. We see that in Gaza with the eastern perimeter and the buffer zone that is being expanded, where trees are being uprooted, where agricultural land is destroyed. You see a kind of a colonially imposed climate change on those regions. We are seeing a desertification of those regions. So pretty much colonialism is intricately linked in questions of climate change, in questions of climate crisis. But the climate crisis also comes to exacerbate the existing inequalities, the existing dispossession, the existing dynamics of apartheid and settler colonialism. So we always need to place discussions on climate change within the stories of settler colonialism.
When you were talking there, you mentioned the relationship between the indigenous population and the land that they live on. And they also mentioned the JNF. I didn't want to cut your train of thought there, but you remind me of something, which is even prior to 1948, the Jewish National Fund would buy up land from absentee landowners because of the way that the Ottoman system worked at the time. They'd buy land from absentee landowners, people who didn't live on the land. And they would go to essentially take over that piece of land, and they'd find farmers there. Because the relationship between the Palestinian farmer and the land wasn't that of, oh, I own this piece of land. It's just they were farmers, they tended to the land, they allowed the land to flourish in its own way. And that process and that relationship was severed even prior to 1948. And there was also actually, in a conversation I had with Suzanne Abul Hawa a few months ago, she was talking about the swamps in Palestine, in which the European settler would come and they would see this swamp and they would think that this is something they needed to change in order to make it more European in a sense, or more livable. And they would destroy entire ecosystems.
Yeah, they did that in Algeria too. You know, they removed those swamps. They introduced new plant species like the eucalyptus. The eucalyptus tree in Algeria is not a native tree, and it's the same thing. It's not a native tree in the Mashriq, in the Middle East, like it's in Lebanon. You know what they imported it? The French, they imported it from Australia.
Wow.
What was the argument? It's gonna bring more rain to the region, and it ended up creating other environmental implications for that. But that's the colonial environmental project, is first of all to Europeanize, to Judaize, in the case of Palestine, and to remove the natives, to eliminate the native entirely, their indigenous culture, their environment. And it's really important to have the analysis when we talk about the environment, because most of the time when we talk about climate change and environment, it's just we depoliticize the issues. We cannot, it's a systematic question. It's about the imperialist colonial capitalist system. If we don't have a conversation about this, we're missing the point.
That brings me on to something, that we in the West hear a lot about. Okay, turn the lights off when you're not using them. Don't use too much water. Your carbon footprint, right? All of these terms used in order to kind of put the onus on the individual. So before we delve further into the colonial aspects in Palestine, is there any truth or any merit to seeing it from an individual perspective, individualist perspective? Everyone has individual responsibility, or is it purely the onus on the great corporations and the politicians to make a change and to take responsibility?
Yeah. I get asked that question several and many times, and it is a legitimate question. I think, look, there is individual and there is collective responsibility, but what we are seeing in the mainstream narrative and the mainstream discourse, either in the media or coming from our ruling classes and governments, is that let's shift the conversation. Let's not talk about the real culprits. Let's not talk about, the systemic causes of that climate and ecological crisis. Let's shift the discussion to the individuals, to individual responsibility. You need to do your bit for the environment. You need to consume less. You need to travel less. You need to eat meat less. There is some truth in that. I think we are human beings and we live in societies. We have individual responsibility. But what is wrong in this narrative is when you just focus on individuals, especially the poorest amongst us, especially the least responsible in causing the climate crisis, the people who emit nothing, almost nothing, especially the poorest, when I talk about the poorest in India or the poorest in some African countries, and you forget about the biggest polluters. Yeah? So there are different levels of the analysis here. There is the analysis at the global level in terms of nations. The historical responsible nations of causing the climate crisis is the industrialized West, without a doubt. And this is scientifically backed. There are many studies looking at the cumulative CO2 emissions that have been accumulated since 1750 with the onset of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, in the UK and Europe. Just between the United States, the European Union, Britain, Australia, and Canada, these nations, basically what we call the global north or the west,
the international community,
or the international community. Yeah, it's always the international community. They mean themselves, right? Just between themselves, they are responsible for 50% of the cumulative CO2 emissions since 1750, right? That doesn't mean that other nations do not have responsibility. There are big nations like Russia, China, India, Brazil are catching up. But historically, they are not responsible for causing the climate crisis, right? So we should talk about these nations and what they should be doing in terms of climate reparations, putting money, grants, transfer of technology, and helping poorer nations that are facing the impacts of the climate crisis and do not have the means to tackle it in terms of finance and technology, right? So that's the first level of analysis. The second level of analysis is in terms of corporations, Corporations, just you look at the 20 top companies that have been emitting, that emit CO2 every year, all of them are fossil fuel companies. Like the 20 top fossil fuel companies. You know how much are they responsible for emitting every year? 30%, a third, 33%. A third of CO2 emissions are coming from the fossil fuel companies.
Is that just extracting?
It's extracting and selling, and shipping and the transport. So they are responsible for these. And these are not just Western companies. Some of them are also from the global south, including in my home country. So why are we then, when we have all these numbers in terms of responsibility, we shift the blame and say, it's the individual who should be doing and flying less. And then the third element of the analysis is the richest amongst us. Let's have that class analysis. There was a study published by The Guardian and Oxfam. I remember that was 2 years ago, in 2022. And they looked at the disparities and the unevenness in terms of CO2 emissions between various people in terms of their classes and their wealth income. 1% of the richest people in the world, basically the millionaires and the billionaires of this world, the Musk and the Bezos and all these people, which is around 77 million people, are emitting more than 2/3 of the poorest in the planet.
Wow.
Like more than 5 billion people. So these richest, 1% are emitting more than 66% of the poorest. Wow. So now, tell me, should we focus on the richest countries, the richest amongst us globally, and the corporations, or should we focus on a poor farmer in India or a poor driver in someone in Zimbabwe? Doesn't make sense. So you need to focus on the real culprits. They start cutting their emissions first, and then we talk about the poorest individuals, because they are the culprits. They are responsible of driving that climate crisis and benefiting from it as well.
I've actually got an interesting question based off of that. It might be a bit of a moral doozy, but when you are struggling against great empires and whatnot, sometimes you use tools which may cause emissions. For example, AI is a great emitter of carbon emissions. Now, a friend of mine was recently in a panel and he was asked the question, he's developing an AI platform to help the cause. He was asked, are you taking into account, how are you expanding your platform and taking into account the environmental effects of what you're doing? So if in that position where the tools available that are being used by the oppressor are available to you, but they come at a cost.
Yeah.
Where do you stand on that?
Look, it's not black or white. I think we need to have certain principles to guide our conversations, and then it is a case-by-case study, depending on which country we're talking about, on which community we're talking about, on which economic sector we are talking about. then we can have discussions if it is really worth using a fossil fuel based energy source or move towards renewables. But what matters to me is, if we talk about climate justice, is that we need to recognize the historical responsibility, I emphasize this, of the industrialized West and the richest amongst us and the corporate sector in driving and exacerbating the climate crisis. So, if a country in the global south that is not responsible in causing the climate crisis and is vulnerable to the climate impacts, to come and tells you, I need some development so I can create jobs for my own people, so I can feed my own people, and I need to use those resources. You cannot just tell them, no, you cannot use those fossil fuels and gas because, it's not environmentally friendly. But if you put the money, like the richest countries, if they put the money and help them move towards more sustainable, energy systems, that's fine. But if you're not putting the money, you have no moral rights or moral higher ground in terms of saying you need to be much more environmental. You start first, because you caused the climate crisis. And you need to put the money, because that's why I use climate reparations. Climate reparations for me is not about giving debts and loans to poorer countries. You need to repair what the damage that you've done in terms of colonialism, in terms of the climate crisis. So put the money, and then we can talk,
Mm. It feels like we're heading, though, to a kind of a race to the bottom. You talk about the historical responsibility of nations. For example, let's say the US. And then they would look at someone like China and say, okay, but China's, if we roll back now, this is what Trump says all the time, if we roll back now, this climate change is all false because it's all Chinese propaganda, because they want us to lose to the Chinese, for example. I mean, there is, also, although it's incorrect about climate change being some sort of propaganda, there is some truth to the fact that they will lose on the geopolitical stage, the global geopolitical stage, if you will. So if someone is looking to keep hold of the power that they have today, and they know that others might not enact the responsible policies required to create sustainable living. Kind of, what's the solution there? I mean,
that's that's a big question. Like, I'm not gonna pretend that I'm gonna give you kind of a blueprint and a prescription of how to do things, but I'll say one thing. You mentioned China, right? So China is annually right now is the biggest CO2 emitter. I think is much more than the United States. And for sure that they need to do more in terms of reducing their CO2 emissions. But that needs to be balanced with their right for development. So we cannot put China and the US on the same footing and say, both of them need to do exactly the same. And they are big emitters, but let's have an analysis of their political and economic trajectories. China is not the US. The US is, the biggest imperialist power out there, and I wouldn't describe China as an imperialist power yet. It's a political economy. It's an emerging economy. It's huge, and it has the right to develop. But that does not mean that China is doing everything well or to the best of our expectations, because China, at the end of the day, is a capitalist economy, like the United States. It's seeking its own geopolitical and economic interests. It's competing within the interstate system, and we are seeing those geopolitical tensions really intensifying. So if when the US say, China is the biggest CO2, this is hypocrisy. This is really, because China is dominating in terms of the green value chains and is producing more solar power than anybody on earth. It's processing critical raw minerals. That's why the United States and Europe are scared from China. And in here, the one element that I need the listener to be aware of, we're not seeing an energy transition. In that climate crisis that we are seeing, it has become clear that we need to move fast towards renewable energy. We need to phase out fossil fuels. We need to stop, any new projects. No new projects need to come online. Some projects need to continue because we need to extract for the petrochemicals and other stuff and some energy needs. But no new projects need to come. But we're not seeing that. It's not a transition that we are seeing. We are seeing an expansion, an energy expansion, an energy addition, some people call it. Because what you see, fossil capital and green capital are, intertwined, working together. Usually, some of the fossil fuel companies are also investing in renewable energy projects. You find them investing in solar plants, wind farms, green hydrogen. So in reality, what we are seeing is just an expansion of what we have right now. You see, Trump is saying, drill, baby, drill. BP, in the last few weeks, just announced that it's going to stop all its investments in renewable energies. Just imagine. Wow. Like in those times, what we are seeing, an escalation of the climate impacts, including in the global north. It's no longer just in the global south. We are seeing it here in the West, in the US. BP comes and says, I'm going to invest more in fossil fuels, in extracting. So who are the culprits? So it's these people that we need to make accountable and responsibilize. And these people that they need to pay the price for that climate transition. But if we just let them do whatever they do and continue the same, greenwashing narrative, the same lies and deceptions, we are going into the abyss.
I'd like to return to the point about climate justice in Palestine.
Good.
You mentioned earlier that some climate justice activists do not make that connection. But you also mentioned Greta Thunberg. And she was, for a while she was, the poster girl, if you will, of climate activism. And she was, being put forward by all the mainstream outlets. And as a casual onlooker, I was actually quite surprised to see that transition into Palestine activism. So my question to you is, how do you think that connection was made? Maybe not just in her case, but in general, that development was made. And what does it mean for all of these institutions and organizations that once put her forward, that have completely blocked her out of any events and such?
Yeah. I mentioned earlier that, some sections of the climate justice movement, the global climate justice movement, I'm part of it, and I have been involved in many discussions, many fora, and I've seen a kind of, I think, a welcome positive evolution in certain sections, because they started incorporating, discussions and analysis on colonialism, capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy, and linking them to the climate crisis. Because if your analysis that the climate crisis is just one dimension or reflection of the capitalist exploitation and imperialist domination of a human and nature, you will start making those connections automatically. And you would understand that there will be no climate justice at the expense of others. There will be no climate justice just in one country or in one region of the world, while you are sacrificing swaths of countries in the global south. And you would understand that there will be no climate justice on occupied land. Simple. I mentioned how, settler colonialism has been a process of imposed climate change and slow desertification. But at the same time, we are seeing, Israel playing, the green steward and the green champion, trying to greenwash its colonial crimes. So if you have that analysis, anti-systemic analysis, you cannot, escape from connecting the dots. And Greta has managed to do that. And I'm really happy to see that evolution from, as you say, the poster girl, and she's becoming a radical activist, connecting the dots, having an intersectional analysis, centering Palestine in her discussion. Not just Palestine, she's centering, indigenous communities as well, other colonized people in the world. And I think it's not just her. Like, the younger generations are really inspiring us, and when you've seen what the students and the young protesters all over the world come in, to support Palestine, you get inspired and say, there is hope. There is hope. But just like to come back on the connections between the struggle for climate justice and the struggle to liberate Palestine, because it may seem, how can I say, inappropriate or misplaced to talk about environmental and climate questions when a genocide is still ongoing, is taking place, when hundreds of thousands of people are dead, when people are starving, when homes are destroyed, when the whole perimeter of Gaza is just utter destruction. But as I said, and I like to emphasize more, there will be no climate justice without the liberation of Palestine. And I say this is not sloganeering, because it is connected to, as I said earlier, to the political economy of Palestine and Israel as a settler colony, and the wider Middle East region and their insertion into the global capitalist economy. Let me explain. So, U.S. hegemony in the region lies or is founded on two key pillars. The first pillar is Israel as a Euro-American settler colony, which is a kind of an imperial advanced outpost, what some people describe as, the biggest American air carrier in the world. That's Netanyahu. That's how he describes it, by the way. Israel is a mighty U.S. air carrier. They know their role, in the region and beyond. And you have the second pillar, which is the oil-rich Gulf monarchies, right? So U.S. depends on these two pillars so it can maintain its hegemony, domination, control of the huge oil resources in the region that will cement its domination in the region and globally. Because something that usually missing in the political economy analysis is a serious consideration of the Middle East as a key nodal point in the global fossil fuel regime. The region, especially the Gulf countries and Iraq, remain the central axis of the international hydrocarbon markets, with a production of around 35% of oil. And so you see the importance of the region into the global political economy. So that's why the US needs to control it and dominate it. And Israel plays an important role in that. So the efforts of the United States and its allies to bring these two key pillars together, while inserting Israel into a dominant position in the economy and energy sphere of the Arab region and the Middle East, through what we call the normalization deals. There has been normalization deals with Egypt and Jordan in the past, but we've seen a second wave of normalization in 2020 under Trump when he was in the White House in his first term. That was with Morocco, Sudan, Bahrain, and Emirates. And there was expectation that there will be a normalization deal with Saudi Arabia. And we've seen that Hamas, with the 7 October, Al-Aqsa flood, disrupting the whole thing. So based on this, mainly political economy analysis, Palestine liberation becomes not simply a human right or moral issue. It becomes an essentially and fundamentally a struggle against global fossil capitalism, because that global fossil capitalism is maintained by the Gulf monarchies and also by Israel wanting to play a kind of an energy hub by giving, exploration permits for many companies in the Eastern Mediterranean to exploit gas so it can send it to Europe. But then it's also a struggle against US-led imperialism. So you cannot dissociate, if you're really serious about fighting global fossil capitalism and US-led imperialism, Palestine becomes, central in those struggles. So You cannot have climate justice without the liberation of Palestine, without the dismantling of the Zionist entity, and without, the overthrow of the reactionary oil-rich monarchies. This is fundamental. So any climate justice activist needs to take this analysis seriously and do whatever it takes to escalate the efforts to isolate Israel on the energy level, in terms of energy embargoes, in terms of weapon embargoes, but also in terms of deconstructing and uncovering the lies and deceptions of the greenwashing mechanism that Israel is doing right now. Because Israel is also a champion in terms of water desalination. It's a champion in terms of also renewable energy. So it's doing all these deals with many countries in the Arab region and beyond, creating new dependencies with these countries. So then the energy security, the food security, and the water security of these countries become much more important than the Palestinian cause. So that's why we need to be against the normalization agenda of Israel with other countries in the world, but also push for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So in order to stop the genocide.
Do you think that adding this climate justice dimension to the activism that's already existing on the ground, do you think that will push things further along?
I think we need to continue pushing. Things do not happen like spontaneously. It's not just by me putting forward their analysis, or other people like Adam Hania or Andreas Malm putting that forward, the centrality of Palestine in the struggle against global fossil capitalism and US-led imperialism, that things would change overnight. No. We need, to continue organizing, campaigning, pushing those discussions centered in Palestine all the time. And some of us are trying to do that at various levels, including the trade unions. We feel that targeting the trade unions, especially the trade unions working in energy sectors in various countries, including Azerbaijan, including Turkey, including South Africa. South Africa, till now, they had a honorable position of taking, Israel to the International Court of Justice, but South Africa still exports coal to Israel. We need, to follow on the footsteps of Colombia, that stopped, sending coal to Israel a few months ago. We need to push Brazil. The climate talks are taking place this year in Brazil in November. We need to push the civil society there and the trade unions to push their government so they can stop sending oil to Israel. So there is a lot of work to be done at various levels, and I feel pushing that conversations within, the climate justice, the energy democracy spaces is very important. And some people are making the dots. We mentioned Greta Thunberg, but President Petro, for example, the Colombian president, in the climate talks in the Emirates at COP28, that was in 2023. Yeah, 2023, December 2023. He made a speech, and I think it resonated with so many of us in the climate justice movement. He said, look, genocide and the barbaric acts being committed against the Palestinian people right now is what awaits millions of black and brown people fleeing the south because of the climate crisis. He said, Gaza is the rehearsal of our future. And he's absolutely right. If we really do not organize vigorously to fight that system of destruction and death, that's what the global ruling classes are doing. Actually, that's what they are already doing. They are sacrificing migrants. They are killing them, not letting them drown. They are killing them in the Mediterranean. They are also, sacrificing the vulnerable communities in the south. They are facing the impacts of the climate crisis. I was in Azerbaijan for the last climate talk, COP29. And it was called the Conference of Climate Finance. Finally, the richest nations are going to commit some money to the nations of the global south so they can adapt and mitigate the climate crisis. The money is not forthcoming, is not legally binding. It's going to be in the form of additional debts and loans. So it's a total moral bankruptcy and failure, I would say. So they are willing to sacrifice millions of us. And we are seeing it right now in the austerity measures here in the North and the West. So they are happy to rearm and spend hundreds of billions of dollars or euros or pounds in rearming, but they're going to cut social services. They're gonna, how can I say, gut out the public services. And who's gonna pay for this? It's the poor people. Always, it's the poor people. We've seen in the recent climate crisis in 2008 how millions of people here in the West have been sacrificed in the name of, saving the economy and doing austerity. So it's really important to connect the dots and to place the climate crisis within those systems of oppression. We can call them colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy. If we do not connect the dots, we're not going to resolve the climate crisis, and there will be always losers and people sacrificed, and in this case, Palestinians.
It sounds like quite a bleak outlook, to be honest. You mentioned the trade unions. But for those who may not be, in contact with trade unions and might have other things to add, what other avenues can they take?
So before I answer the other avenues, alternatives, and what can be done, I think we need to be honest with ourselves. Things are bleak out there. A genocide is being screened in our screens. We are seeing it like daily, online, by the minute, by the hour. Of course, things are bleak. People are dying in hundreds of thousands. People are starving, and we cannot. What we can do right now is just protest. And I think we need to escalate more. We need, to make it painful for the Israeli genocidal regime in terms of, economic embargoes, impacting them in terms of energy, their economies. That's why BDS is very important. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions. But then always bring Palestine to the conversation. It needs to be centered. Colonialism and what we are seeing here in the West, because the West, including the United States, is complicit in the genocide. I think we need to say it clearly, including their mainstream media, including their educational institutions. We need always to center Palestine, because colonialism is erasure. Is trying to erase the indigenous, their stories, their discourses, their inspiration, their resistance. We need always to center this. But we can be pessimistic in the short term. I always use the Gramscian quote, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Because in the long term, things are going to change. I always say, Algeria has been colonized by France for 132 years. And it was one of the most cruel and violent settler colonial experiences that That's why Palestinians and Algerians, are close. They know. They understand each other because it's similar experiences. But we've kicked them out, People are not passive victims. They resist. And we see Palestinians inspiring us every day, despite the gloom and doom, despite the destruction, despite the death, the attachment of land, the ecosomud, the steadfastness of Palestinians, their attachment to land. They want to stay on their land. This is inspiring, and we need to support that. We need to support Palestinian resistance. We need to support their liberation efforts. That may take time. That may take decades. And we need to connect it with, the liberations of other people in the region, Because I don't believe there will be Palestinian liberation without the liberation of other people in the region, in terms of them achieving their democratic rights, in terms of achieving economic and social justice. So it's not about exceptionalizing Palestine. Palestine, in a way, concentrates all those contradictions and ugliness of the system that we are in, but at the same time, it gives us hope and inspiration that people, whatever you throw at them, whatever destructions whatever attempts you want to uproot them from their land, they remain.
Yeah.
They remain. And I think that's sometimes we need to frame it that way. Yeah, there is gloom and doom. It's a bleak picture, but Palestinians keep inspiring us. Palestinians keep resisting, and I think we need to push for that. Center the discussion everywhere. If you're not part of a trade union, join a trade union and push that conversation in your trade union in terms of BDS. If you're not going out in those protests every week, you need to go in those protests every week. If you're not speaking enough on Palestine, you need to speak on Palestine. If you have privileges in terms of organizing activities and events on Palestine, do so. Bring those stories, stories of hope, stories of resistance. But at the same time, we need to make the ruling classes in this country accountable, because they are complicit with genocide. Yeah, they are being elected. They need to be made accountable. Continue the pressure at multiple levels, and hopefully, and I'm hopeful. I'm even if I'm pessimistic in the short term, I'm hopeful in the long term. Things will change.
Have you read the Dune books or seen the movies?
Which one?
Dune.
No, I haven't.
So in your response there, you just reminded me of something, and maybe the parallels aren't exactly the same, but in the Dune series, at least in the first book, there is a planet in this galactic empire.
I see.
And this planet has a resource. It's called spice. And the people of this planet have been oppressed by the empire because the empire thought or saw it necessary to keep them oppressed in order for them to extract the spice, exploit the natural resources. And so it was necessary to the function of the empire, or the empire decided it was necessary for the functioning of the empire for this people to be oppressed. And because of how extreme the oppression became, these people, led by a sort of messiah figure, but these people ended up rising up and overthrew the entire empire. And maybe it's a bit grandiose, but from our conversation today and conversations I've had with people, I feel like Palestine might be headed in that way because the empire, the American empire, has decided that the extraction of resources, the importance of the oil, the oil economy, and therefore the oppression of the Palestinians has become necessary for the empire to function. I don't know, maybe you have some thoughts on that.
I think I haven't seen the Dune.
They're interesting films. They're interesting films.
I think I'm curious now. I may go and see and try to make some parallels with Palestine. But this is the story of empires and colonial powers. It's not just a political enterprise. At the heart, it is an economic one. It's about economic extraction. It's about making those lands work for you. It's about commodifying. It's about using, the cheap labor there, disciplining the cheap labor, slaves, serfs, and exploited workers. The same thing happened in so many settler colonies, and the colonialism works that way through extraction. But then those systems of domination and extraction get expanded, and it becomes neo-colonialism, even if you're, let's say, politically independent, formally political independent, your economy is still being controlled. And we see that in so many countries in Africa where former colonial powers have huge economic stakes, and they dictate what you should be doing for your own economy, what you should be extracting, what you should be exporting, while creating sacrifice zones, externalizing the environmental and social costs, creating poverty in those areas, and at the same time, they get richer and richer. So when we come to the discussion on Palestine, I think that's why we need to broaden the discussion. It's not just about Palestine and Israel, because That's what we hear in the mainstream media, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Or even Hamas conflict.
Or just Hamas, it's Israel and Hamas. So it's just that is the problem. No. We need to go back a little bit and we see how Israel, that Zionist project, has been a colonial project since day one, and it has been connected with Western colonialism since the early 20th century. So when you start making those connections, you would understand why the US and the West are supporting that settler colony, because they are seeing it as part of their civilizing mission project, because they see those people in the region as subhumans or non-humans at all. What matters is to dominate those. You've seen that video where Trump shared it. I don't think it's him who made it. Somebody made something with the AI.
Yeah.
I think it was a sarcastic video showing how Gaza has been transformed into that real estate paradise with, big towers, hotels, people are having fun, cocktails, and that is the logic of settler colonialism. They want to destroy all that land, erase all that environment, erase the relationship that Palestinians have with their lands, and what kind of relationship in terms of doing the agriculture, valuing their environments, and replace it with that, futuristic, hyper-capitalist model. This is colonialism for you. It's based on extraction. It's based on extractivism. It's based on exploitation. That's why, for me, Palestine becomes a global front, against empire, against colonialism, and against white supremacy that we need to center in all our discussions. But then we need to resist the tendency to exceptionalize it and say, it's just Palestine is the exception. No, there are other countries where we are seeing cruel wars, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Sudan, Yemen, Myanmar. I think those connections need to happen to create that transnational movement of solidarity, an anti-systemic movement that will change the balance of forces on the ground and challenge that system. And I think that's a revolutionary project, a long-term revolutionary project, but we need to prepare for it from now.
On a final note, how do you envision that the liberation of Palestine will factor into this movement? We saw for example, the Arab Spring. For a while, there seemed to be a movement towards democracy and to justice and whatnot, and then the regional powers decided that they didn't want to deal with that anymore, that this wasn't in their interests. And so my question is, with, let's say, the dismantlement of the Zionist entity, does that necessarily lead to climate justice?
Or maybe does it lead to justice, political, economic, and social justice? No. That's why in my discussion here, I was talking about, first of all, the dismantlement of the settler colony of Israel. This is a sine qua non condition for the liberation of Palestinians and other Arab people. But at the same time, we need to overthrow those reactionary regimes, traitorous regimes, I would say. The regimes that normalized with Israel and with its allies in the West by sacrificing Palestinians. And I'm talking here about Egypt, about Jordan, about the Gulf monarchies, about Morocco, about Sudan. So all these regimes are sacrificing the Palestinians. If they are sacrificing the Palestinians that way, do you think that they care about their own people? They don't. They don't. So for me, it's a protracted, iterative operation of fighting for your rights. And I always use also the example of Algeria. Does it mean that when we expelled the French that we finally became free? No. You need to continue struggles for social and economic justice, for democratization. And that's what people continue to do. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they fail, sometimes there are shortcomings. This is the history, of struggle for liberation. Liberation cannot be complete when other people in your neighborhood is being oppressed, or in other countries are being oppressed. So that's why we need to connect the dots. For me, Palestinian liberation is also inseparable from the liberations of other people in the region, or in Africa, or in the global south, or even in Europe, So we need to connect those dots. Otherwise, you will have blind spots. And what does it mean to dismantle a settler colony of Israel when reactionary regimes like Saudi Arabia and Emirates are doing similar crimes and similar exploitations in the region and in other African countries? We shouldn't be reproducing those patterns of exploitation, extraction. Emirates and Saudi Arabia are reproducing those in the Arab region and in other African countries. That's why those countries, for me, are sub-imperial powers. They reproduce the same patterns of exploitation and extraction. We've seen how they are grabbing a lot of land in Sudan, in Ethiopia, so they can feed themselves at the expense of local populations. We see their capital and corporations in the region trying to dominate some economic sectors. And at the same time, they normalize with Israel. They deal with Israel at the expense of Palestinians. So we cannot be naive and expect that we're going to get freedom and justice from those regimes and those political elites. No. Economic pressure, political pressure needs to happen everywhere. In the West, in there. Sometimes it's difficult, especially in military dictatorship and authoritarian regimes, to come up and express yourselves. But yeah, you do what you can.
Hamza, it's been an absolute pleasure. There's so much more we can talk about. This conversation could go on for so much longer, but in the interest of time, we're going to have to end it here.
Thank you.
I hope you can join us again for us to continue.
Yeah, thank you for hosting me. That was a good discussion.
Thank you so much.